and welcome to episode 130 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Killorn in sunny Napa Valley.
Well, it's a good day for some sunshine, man. I know you got big plans this afternoon. We talked about this on the podcast before, but it might be worth one more mention.
Are you talking about the Spivey meetup tonight?
Yes, I am.
Which reveals the fact that today is Wednesday, April 19th. We're actually recording this in the morning. That's unusual. But yes, I'll be meeting up with Spivey Consulting and a bunch of the consultants there in Napa Valley, in Napa City at 6 p.m. tonight. So if you're in the area, come join us. I think it's the Norman Rose Tavern, which I've never been to.
Interesting. Yeah. Open bar, at least for a bit.
That's correct. And that's the most important thing.
But because,
Uber in, Uber out.
But because we're doing this in the morning, our drink choices are not quite as fun as they're going to be later. Certainly yours are going to be later. What are you drinking this morning?
One of my favorites. It's a Monster Energy. It's this zero sugar. This is that orange flavored one. It's Ultra Sunrise.
Oh, yeah.
And I was talking to one of our LSAT colleagues last night, and I was telling her I drink one every day, and she couldn't believe it. She was freaking out about it, but it is so tasty that I have to.
I feel like at some point you should ask a doctor about this.
They'll say it does taste good.
Oh, that's what they'll say. Yeah. Flavor
I only
burst.
drink one. I don't drink coffee. This is just the one thing. It's not my only vice, but it's one vice.
Yeah, well, I'm not doing anything much better, so I can't really throw stones here. I'm drinking a sugar-free Red Bull. So both of us trying to caffeinate as we get through this. It has been a long test weekend and long kind of early test concluding week. So there we go. But, and this will lead right into the song, which I'll let you talk about. Fortunately, the test is wrapped. Time is up. I don't know if that was my best segue. But we get to finally talk about it, and that's what this is going to be today. Before we do, though, what is the song, Dave?
Well, I went to see Muse this past Friday in Oakland, and they always play one of their big hits from Absolution. It's called Time Is Running Out, and love the song. It struck me as apropos for the fact that ProctorU has got only 2 more tests. This April one that just passed, and now the final June test, so their time is running out. It's a little tie-in there.
I like it.
If you get a chance to see Muse live, though, you should go check it out. I've literally worked on the LSAT until 5 p.m. Pacific on Friday and jumped in the car, went down there, got back home at like 1 a.m. It was a long day.
Yeah, only to get right back to it Saturday morning.
It's fantastic. You and I were talking Saturday night at 10:30 p.m. working on some stuff. It has been a long week. And we'll talk about why that is actually the case to some extent. But let's talk about the LSAT world here, John. What's going on?
Well, first things first, obviously, while we're here today, the April test. I say it's wrapping up. The main testing days, the accommodations, the internationals have all finished. There is a makeup test, as always, next week, which we'll talk about probably. The big thing for most people, though, at this point is score release, which is going to come on Wednesday, May 3rd, 9 a.m. Eastern. And then, of course, the next test, which you just referenced with ProctorU's final hurrah, is the June test. Registration for that is April 25th, or the deadline is April 25th. The dates for the June test are Friday and Saturday, June 9th and June 10th. Same deal as always, runs all day. But I have a bit of a bone to pick here. I bet you do too.
Yeah. You want to pick it first?
Who picks first?
Well, if you listen to those dates carefully, you'll realize that the registration deadline for June closes well before the score release date for April. And these tests are not in consecutive months where I could understand it. These tests are, they're not exactly 2 months apart, but they are April and June. I do not understand this at all. They've been better about this, especially last year, in terms of allowing people to get the scores from a test like April and then decide whether or not they wanted to take June and still have 24 hours. So I have to call upon LSAC to move that June registration deadline back until maybe May 5th or so. but May 4th at the latest, so that people have at least a day to decide whether or not they need to take the June. This is a misscheduling, or I don't think it's intentional. I just think it's an error that they didn't realize. They need to fix this.
It does. It almost feels like a mistake.
Yeah.
It's like a 7-week cutoff, give or take. April 25th to June 9th. That's by far the earliest deadline I've seen for a test in a long, long time.
Well, they made a commitment a while back to allow people to have time after a result came out to decide on the next available LSAT. So I know this has been a commitment. They'd actually done a really good job with it. We've commended them before for like, hey, that's actually student friendly. We think it's good. This is unfriendly, and I don't understand the reason. So maybe somebody from LSAC will give me an explanation. But even so, instead of an explanation, just change it.
Just change it. Yeah, make it May 5th or something.
Yeah.
All right, we got a few free webinars coming up. We always talk about these. You can find them all, and you should register at powerscore.com/free seminars. The next one is actually April 26th. It's on basic conditional reasoning. What I like about that one, aside from the fact that conditional reasoning is just hugely important, is it actually covers conditionality as it applies to both LR and games. So you get a lot of bang for your buck going to that particular webinar. That's a good one. We have a follow-up to it on May 10th, Advanced Conditional Reasoning. That one's going to be focused more exclusively on LR, but the two of them together are just quite a pair. I'm not saying you're going to walk away from both of those feeling like a conditional reasoning master and nothing else to study, but they're a really, really good place to start.
You'll get closer.
You will get much closer, and sandwiched in between, Dave, we have something of a special event, or at least a first-time event, with you and me. We are doing something we've never done before, which is we are taking the Crystal Ball webinar that we did for April and June, and we are giving it a second look, so to speak, now that we have the April information in hand, now that we've seen some things that have happened, and we're providing what is essentially an updated but much more exclusive and specific look at June only. That's going to be a very cool discussion. I'm looking forward to it. It's called The Crystal Ball Revisited. It's May 9th. I'm going to let you elaborate on that groan in a second, maybe. It's May 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern. So come join me and Dave and probably another instructor or two, as we typically do with these things that get enormous. And especially for the June test takers, this is going to be really a second chance for you to get all the information you need about your tests, but even more bespoke, even more tailored and customized, because we learned some things.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about what this is.
Yeah.
First off, it is focused for June test takers only. So if you're a June test taker, this is in your wheelhouse. If you're thinking about taking a later test, this isn't something that applies to you. But we've been doing these 2 LSATs at a time to kind of make life easy. And so we did April and June, and then enough changed here. And it's happened before, but we didn't do updates. But this time we decided to do so. Enough changed in April in terms of what they released, what we predicted actually appearing, that we feel the need to update the problem sets to make further changes. And so this isn't a full crystal ball. We're not going to run through all the percentages of questions and the likelihood of them showing up. We'll keep the April-June one up, and that's where all that information will reside. Instead, this is a pared down crystal ball that is focusing primarily on problem sets, what to do, and then predicted test reuses. The in-house name that I've been using for this is mini ball. Marketing didn't like mini ball. And I'm like, no, I will make it the mini ball going forward, because it's a crystal ball variant and it is a revisitation of it, but it is also pared down. It's not going to be an hour and a half the way the regular crystal balls are. I'm hoping it's maybe 45 minutes, but it'll be very specifically focused on that. So come join us for the crystal mini ball, or as marketing has called it, the Crystal Ball Revisited, here on May 9th. And Jon, you and I have some work to do, because although I've written the outline for it, I know what we're going to do, we actually now have to go do it. So I guess we'll be talking about that next week.
Yeah. Speaking of crystal balls, I can see our future. Pretty labor intensive. But that is a conversation for you and for me for another day. It's time for April. Let's get into the tests. And one of the things that you tend to do as we start these off is just run through the numbers. So if you will do as you always do and indulge us, how do the numbers look for this test?
Pretty good. And LSAC is quite gracious in providing me with these numbers, and especially test taker numbers throughout the day, kind of in a real time or slightly delayed fashion. Something that I really, really do appreciate. And if you follow me on Twitter, I tend to share it there while Twitter still lives. Maybe I'll move to a different platform at some point. But this was a pretty big test. In fact, relative to last April, it ended up being about, I'd say 45 to 4,600 people larger than last April. Now, it is not a direct comparison, though, because we did not have a March test this year. Last year, they did have a March test. So that kind of like soaked up some of the difference. The overall test taker numbers aren't all that different when you take a look at it. But on Friday, you had somewhere around 6,500 people scheduled to take this. You always end up with a melt that's around 10% on a daily basis. And so the actual number was around 5,900 people who took the test on Friday. So a reasonable test day, nowhere near the largest test days that we've seen, though, which, get into like the 10,000 range. On Saturday, you had about 7,400 people scheduled. Only about 6,600 actually took the test. Again, a pretty normal melting of scheduled to actual. Then on this Tuesday, yesterday, as a matter of fact, you had two different groups. You had the paper and pencil test takers, which is really stable from test to test at around 100 to 150 people. And then you had the international test takers. Sometimes these groups are really big, like 1,000. This group, I think, was closer to like 400, 450. Something that actually impacted you and I, Jon, and pushed us from recording last night to pushing today, as we had some issues with international information that we'll talk about. And then coming up in a week or so, you'll have 100, maybe 200 makeups, test takers. And so when it all comes down, you end up in around like the low 13,000s for the number of test takers. And you go back in the history of the LSAT, that's a decent sized test. It's certainly nowhere near the largest test. It's nowhere near the largest digital tests, which, regularly on the larger side are like 19, 20,000 or more. But still a pretty significant size test overall when you have 13,000 people sitting for a test. And they ended up using a fair number of test forms, I think more than you and I expected them to actually go through.
Yeah.
The one note I will make, what we're about to talk about for the April test does not apply to the retakers who are coming up next week. That's always the case. We always say this, so we're not giving them a preview of what they're going to see. They will get a different test, primarily to stop the kind of information sharing that would benefit them. That wouldn't be fair. I think we all can agree on that. So let's move on. We talked a little bit of how Proctor used time is running out. This is the second to last one for them. How'd they do, Jon?
I think they did all right. I didn't see anything terribly major. You may have seen something I didn't, but aside from, and again, I don't want to downplay for individuals who had issues, aside from what were some delays to start and just the typical, tech stuff that people run into, I didn't see anything where Proctor, you really dropped the ball systemically or in some sort of widespread, holistic way.
I think I saw two issues that, at least one of them we see a lot. There were some individuals in particular who had delayed start times.
Sure.
Waiting for the proctor. That always happens. I obviously wish that it didn't. And I've said this before. Anytime you have an issue on the LSAT, it is instantaneously major. Even if it feels or might look from the outside to be small, everything is terrible when it actually happens in a negative sense on this test. You lose a minute in one of the sections. To me, that's catastrophic. So I saw some test delays. In one case, I was talking to a test taker who was like, by the time I got into the test, I was already exhausted. I had waited like an hour and a half, and my energy was gone. And as the test went on, it just got worse and worse. And that's the kind of like cascading effect that you never want to see. I saw a number of issues with like test zones timing. I had more than a few people, more than a handful, tell me that their time for their test had been reset to a different time zone. Like they were on Central and it got reset to an Eastern time zone. I actually flagged that to LSAC, who went and looked at it and said they weren't seeing anything greater than normal. But that was one other issue that I felt an unusual number of people citing to me as a problem.
I saw some of those too.
Overall, was there any huge systemic issue where the system went down or there was something like that, something hugely catastrophic to hundreds or thousands of test takers? No. The problem seemed to be individualized. And as Jon and I were just saying, when that happens to you, it's terrible.
Yep.
And if it's a big enough issue, they will grant you a retake. And they give you, it's another week away or so before that retake comes up. But just be aware if something really bad happens that they can reschedule you. Now, if something minor happens, like you lose a minute or two, minor in their eyes, they probably won't give you the retake. It has to be something greater than just a minimal disruption. I don't love that policy. I understand that policy, but I don't really agree with it. So just something to be aware of.
Well, there you go. They're going out without a bang, which is probably the way they should. So
wait, don't jinx it. There's one more test for them for Proctor you to screw up. Let's not have that happen.
Fair enough.
But let's get into what we were really here to talk about, which is the content on the April test. And we're going to first talk a little bit about the international test, and then we're going to go into the domestic U.S. test because there's an overlap there, which will help some of those international test takers. But as is always the case, I am going to list out some disclaimers. And if you've never heard them before, definitely listen to them because they give you some test insight. And if you've been skipping them in the past, or you listened to it once a long time ago, listen to it again anyway, because I see so many things online that relate to some of the things I'm going to mention here that are inaccurate or misunderstood. And if there's one thing that I know, Jon, that you and I really wish to do, it's to stamp out a misunderstanding around how this test works.
Yeah.
I do it when I talk to students, but I love this platform because it gives us access to thousands and thousands of people to be able to say, hey, that's not actually the way it works. So the first thing is in this list of disclaimers, and it'll also be the last one, is we ask you so politely, so kindly, please do not summarize this online. It's a free podcast. Just send people to the podcast to listen to it. There is nuance in this that we often talk about. It is easy to miss that when you're just recounting it in a straight up way. We'd prefer people to hear it directly from us. Second disclaimer, especially when you're thinking about your test and your test day, section order, if it's identical to another person, does not mean that you had the same test content. Sometimes they'll flip sections, like RC 1 and 4. That doesn't mean that you had the same 1 and 4. That other person might have had 4 and 1, or they might have had one of your sections and then totally different one. I watched people all weekend saying, oh yeah, we had the same test, and then telling me they had the same test on occasion. And I was like, you didn't have the same test actually. That's just the way that it works. It's a kind of a anti-cheating thing for LSAC. It's a security measure. If you're aware of it, then you don't get too drawn into what someone else says, like, oh, that first RC was so much harder. And you're like, gosh, I thought my fourth one was harder. It helps understand the context and the perspective of what we're saying as well. But sections, content, and orders change all day long for all the main test days. That has been a feature of this since they went online during the pandemic. When you talk about information about this test, you can disclose generalities and topics. What they don't want is they don't want you to post answers or specifics or solutions, anything that helps people identify what the experimental is or what answers would be during the test itself. Once the main testing days are over, they don't mind so much, which is one of the reasons that we're able to put together a lot of information here. I will note very importantly, and this is about to come up in a moment, if we don't hear from you as a group, we can't make predictions. If we don't know what RC passages, for example, the international test takers had, or what LR questions they had, there's no way for us to connect it to the vast database of prior information that we have on hand. And so if we don't hear from you, sometimes we're not going to be able to make predictions about your test. Another thing to remember is that as you take the LSAT, it's almost always the case that it is going to feel worse on the actual day than for any prior practice test you've taken. And that tends to put a negativity bias into how you see and recall the test. Just be aware of that. So many people come out and say, that was the hardest test ever. And of course, it felt that way. I'm not diminishing that emotional response. But also the pressure is way worse when you're taking the actual exam than when you're sitting at home knowing that if you don't do well, it's not going to be on the so-called permanent record. Again, we talk about difficulty. You might hear us say something's easier or harder. We're not saying it's easy. Don't make a relativity flaw. We're talking about everything on the LSAT being difficult. It's just on the lower side of the high difficulty as opposed to the middle or upper side of high difficulty. So just be aware of that. Remember also that test makers are trying to confuse you by placing the same topics in multiple sections. This is something they do all the time. You might have a question about a central business district, and someone else may have a different question about a central business district. That is, again, a security measure, something they've been doing for years now. Just be aware of that. You can't use simple 1 or 2 word codes to say, oh, we had the same section, just because we had one kind of generalized topic in common. You have to be more specific than that. Also, our estimations of real and experimental sections are based on certain assumptions about the reusage, namely that prior scored sections will come back as real sections and not experimental. So be aware of that. They could change that. I will say so far they've never done that, and we've never been wrong about identifying a real versus an experimental section, and we have identified hundreds of them at this point. So we've yet to have a miss, but we're always like keeping, there are assumptions that are involved here. And as we get to the end here, John, some people may not hear their section discussed when we go through this, or they may not recall the questions mentioned. That is something that does happen a lot. Later on, they're like, oh yeah, I did have that. Information these days is a little bit more limited than it has been in the past. There's more controls on what people can share right after the test because it's not just one test, it's multiple tests. That makes it harder for us to cross-reference. Sometimes takes longer for us to do so. Also, some groups of test takers are very, very small, and maybe only a few people got that test information. If they don't reach out to us and tell us about it, there's no way for us to connect it back to all the information we have about these sections, and so we won't bring it in. And then last, same as the first, we ask that you do not summarize this online. It's just you miss too much nuance. We want people to hear what we said directly. Just send them to the podcast since it's free. And on that note, John, let's talk about the International LSAT for the April exam.
Whew. Take a lap, man. Well done.
Victory lap? Not yet.
Not yet. All right. At the bar then. The International LSAT, which is an interesting case for us here this time, as we'll get into, and you've kind of alluded to as well. Here's what I can say for sure. Seems there were at least 2 different test forms or constructions in use. And by that, I mean 2 different combinations of content were being used. One, and I saw this very, very rarely, I saw maybe 1 or 2 people total that had this, was a double reading comp LSAT for international students. The good news here is that the content that was involved in the double RC matches stuff that we're going to talk about from the domestic test. So if you had an international exam that had reading comp experimental, sit tight. We're going to cover you as we get into the domestic test here in just a minute. But that was one of the forms that I saw. The other and much more common construction that international test takers seem to get was double LR. So if you had an LR experimental, we're going to dive a little deeper into your content right now. And the first thing I'll say about this is, go us. The test that was used here, reused here really, is an exact test that we predicted in our latest crystal ball. So if people are a little unsure from the crystal ball discussion that we had at the outset of this about the mini ball, what we do in the original big ticket kind of crystal balls is we try to make predictions or at least informed guesses as to what we think is likely to reappear. And we go all the way sometimes down to the level of topic and subject matter. This was one of those tests that we got that deep into. Specifically, it was the October 2020 LSAT. Or at least content from the October 2020 LSAT, stuff that we saw reused again, partially at least in August of 2021. This was a candidate for reuse here. It did not get reused domestically, but the international people, by and large, got it. So that's pretty cool. Anyone overseas who attended the Crystal Ball, and I know there were hundreds and hundreds of you, hopefully this helped. You should have recognized some of this content.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They did. I can guarantee you, because I didn't hear from too many international test takers, but the first one I heard from was like, it was the test you predicted, Dave. And I'm like, and so they were, and they'd had a test proctoring problem, so they were really upset by that. And it's funny, John, I'll just make an aside about the whole process of the Crystal Ball, and it's something I'm sure we'll talk about in the mini ball as well. When we get down to those kind of like topics of passages and so forth, that is not the meat of what we're doing. It's almost like a little bit of fun that we're getting into where we're like, look, if you don't know about this, it could really be helpful for you to look at it. But our expectation is that there's a chance that might appear. But it's not predicated upon you should expect that this is going to be your passage.
Right.
Instead, what's really important are the problem sets that we predict, because those model the generalized content of what we expect for test reuse. And when we get it right, as we did on both the international test here as well as the domestic test, it means that we've given our students problem sets that have similar types of games, similar types of passages, or really passage structures. Maybe we said, hey, make sure you know who Chinua Achebe is, but we gave you a passage about banking that has a really similar structure to it so you can kind of see the way the ebb and flow of the information is going to work. So, John, you and I were talking online with somebody who was like, oh, they didn't predict my passages. And I'm like, first off, do you realize how insane it is to even be able to predict any passages for any person? This should never happen. It's like a 1 in 100 million shot in general. So yeah, if you didn't get some of the predictions, that's okay with us. And if you did, more power to you. We had some people who had like the Vera Brittain passage who were like, I didn't know who that was, so I'd read up on it, made me feel more comfortable. It's not a distraction to learn, in my opinion. Whether you get it or not, I'm not searching for Vera Brittain on my test, but if I get it, I'm going to respond to it. So just kind of like an aside of something that you and I were bothered by, because I feel like that's a misconception of maybe how people understand what we're doing inside the crystal ball. It's like sometimes parts of it are much more important to us than other parts. That's more of a, hey, if you don't know this, this will help. It's entertaining, it's educational, it's informative. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think those are good points. I know it's been on both of our minds since the weekend when we were talking to some people.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the topics then. And I'll start with games. I only saw one set of games used, 23 questions, again, from October 2020 and August 21. These you should recognize if you took the test internationally and had double LR. The first game was about summer camp activities, like hiking, painting, skiing. Second, about musicians at an audition in different concert halls. I think performing at different times, like 9, 10, or 11. Third game, kind of tricky, clay tablets and ancient artifact ages. So ordering, basically, the discoveries of these things. And then finally, easily the hardest game in this section, a game that I hope one day they release, because I'd love to see it, was about fashion brands assigned to magazines. This is tough. I say magazines. It may have been stores. We hear different things. I'm of the opinion this is actually stores.
I believe it is.
Yeah. So fashion brands being displayed in different stores. I'll amend my original comment. And that was the fourth game on this. 7 questions on that game too. So again, no break at the end. You didn't get to taper off. Hardest by far, that particular one. Reading comp. Again, with this particular test set, with the double LR, we only saw one reading comp section being used. 27 questions from the same source, October 20, August 21. And here were the passages. One Dave kind of just alluded to, which was about the novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Reframing Igbo language and tradition. The second passage, I believe, was about EMF litigation. Who's responsible, basically, for value loss, the homeowner or the electricity company? Publicization versus privatization of public work projects like highways. That's the third passage. It was comparative. And then the fourth and final passage was about fungi spores on trees, and they acted as endophytes and protected the trees from damage. And here's where things do, I think, really shine in terms of the value that we provide when we are able to predict these things to this degree. If you've never heard of the idea of an endophyte, for instance, in that last reading comp passage, Well, I put in the latest crystal ball tree endophytes as one of the topics for people to go out there and at least bone up on general knowledge about. If you're not familiar with Things Fall Apart or Chinua Achebe, that was in the crystal ball too. I said, go know who Chinua Achebe is. So these were very, very directly predicted by us, alluded to in terms of like, you need to know not just the nature of how to do reading comp, but we can actually tell you some things that you're likely to see. Go study Chinua. Go learn about endophytes. Know what these things are.
John, before we get to LR, I will say this. 10 years ago, if someone said, there'll come a day in the future when you'll actually be able to have a fairly reasonable likelihood of saying what some of the passage topics will be or some of the game types in various games, I would have laughed and said, zero chance of that ever happening. And I've explained this elsewhere. It's occurring because of the volume of LSATs kicking up to 80 a year and LSAC not really being prepared for that with a test archive, and that forcing a really heavy reuse of exams to the point that it became predictable to us. Mm-hmm. As we'll see when we get to the domestic test, which was the number one test that we predicted as being most likely. So sometimes I laugh about that because I'm like, I could not have imagined a future where we would be able to do this. And I've said it before, I don't know that we'll be able to continue doing it forever. At some point, their test creation and generation division will produce enough exams to keep us kind of behind the eight ball in terms of figuring things out. But the fact that you put things like tree endophytes and Chinua Achebe and several of the other topics that are still to come, to me, it does really kind of amaze me. I'm like, where's my check for that? And you should get one too. You need to get paid.
Thank you. I agree. It's pretty remarkable. It's felt too good to be true for a very long time now. And I keep waiting for like the other shoe to drop. But so far, we'll do this for as long as we're able. I'll put it to you that way.
This is the fact
that we're still able was remarkable to me, kind of shocking. But
it will end.
Here we are. Yeah, here we are once again. All of that sort of happy news being said, let me interject now a note of some disappointment, frankly, and it comes with the LR. There were several sections of LR used on that October 2020 test, reused again in August 21. I didn't hear enough information. I didn't get enough input from students here about the LR topics to know what was used.
Yeah.
Which is a strange concession to make. I'm not sure we've ever done it before, where we're just simply in a position here where we didn't get enough input from students, we didn't get enough data and feedback to be able to talk about LR, real versus experimental, with enough confidence or enough insight that I'd be comfortable trying to do it. And the real bummer of that is this was the split. This was the real versus experimental on all these tests, LR.
And we can't help you. And, to mitigate that to some extent, first off, I'll say the group of international test takers was relatively small. But as I mentioned before, if we don't hear from you, and, by Tuesday night, they allow you to talk about information on the test and talk about general topics and so forth. But if we don't hear from you in that period of time, there is no decision that we can make. And one of the things that you and I did, John, is we pushed this podcast into today because we wanted to wait and hear. And I would imagine that what I'll end up getting after this is a bunch of Twitter emails or Reddit emails, DMs telling me, oh, this is what I had. And, if I can determine it at that point, maybe I'll post it on Twitter or something like that. But this is always the way that it works. We don't know what LSAC is going to do. We have to have information. And we didn't have anyone taking the international test who was a PowerScore employee or anything like that. So we were wholly waiting. We had students tell us, oh, I had the Achebe passage in this, and we're like, we know that section. Same thing happened in Logic Games, but not in LR, and LR is always the hardest anyway. So when we do this kind of scale prediction on this, it's not going to include LR. You're going to have to make your own decision. And for those of you taking the LSAT in the future, whether domestic or international, I hope this doesn't happen again, because this is the kind of thing where it's like we really want to help. And to not be able to do so is frustrating for us. And I know this morning you and I were talking about it. We're like, it would just take a few reports for us to be able to figure this out, because it doesn't take much. We have so much information about prior tests that it doesn't take a whole lot. And at this point, we're in the free information zone. It's frustrating.
Yeah, I'll add one maybe redeeming point for people based on this, because I know there's going to be some frustration as that just got kind of processed. If you go back, you can still listen to our test recap of the October 2020 test. And you can hear what was real in terms of the LR on that test by listening to it. It's episode 68 of the podcast. So if you want to go back to that, use the timestamps, jump to the test discussion. If you hear us talking about a section of LR in there that was real on that test and it matches something you just had, congratulations. That was your real section. Sure would have been nice to hear from you, but at least there's some possible redemption here at the end of it.
Yeah, no input of information means no output of information.
That's
pretty simple. Yeah, so I'm not going to belabor the point any further, but that's what it comes down to. At least from a scoring scale matrix standpoint, let's just finish off the international section here.
Okay.
If you go look at this, we always start off with how many questions you can miss to get a 170, and we always say you can miss 7 questions, -7. The first thing I'll say is that the RC on this test, that Achebe, EMF, privatization, and so on, that's a hard section. That's going to loosen your scoring from 7 to 8. When it comes to logic games, this is the musicians, the clay tablets, the fashion brands to stores. When we talked about this before, what we said was it is 0.5, meaning it's not going to move the scale at 170, but it will move the scale at 160. So now you're really like -8.5. And if you go back and you look at the LR that was kind of connected to this, originally, at least the October 2020 LSAT, it was 0. So even without knowing the topic, if we just kept it at 0 for that, you'd be looking really at -8 for a 170, and then the scale would loosen up a little bit as you move downscale into the 160s. So that is, in fact, the way the scale would look at -8, -8.5. And that's your international test. And if you did have that international test and you want to send us kind of like the update so we can connect the dots, please feel free to do so. We're not going to re-record this, but having that data is good to connect to it.
All right, moving on. And this little interim segment will be quick. There were accommodated test takers yesterday, Tuesday, paper and pencil folks, special things. But every one of them that I heard from, and they were actually pretty generous with information, had content that we saw directly from the domestic LSAT. So if you tested yesterday, Tuesday, with paper and pencil or something else, we expect that we're going to cover your content here as we get into the domestic test. So let's just dive right into that. Dave, you ready?
All right. I am ready. You want me to start, or are you going to start this?
Well, I mean, the first thing to start it with is pretty predictable. It's how'd we do with our predictions?
Yeah. You do that one.
I'll do that one? All right. I'm happy to self-congratulate. With the crystal ball, and Dave has referenced this a bit, but I will get specific about the test itself here. We had one candidate in mind that we thought was by far the most likely to be used here. And this is why a lot of the content that we talked about, appearing topics and reading comps, constructions in games, and the problem sets that we put together for this April coterie of people, this is why it was that we designed that crystal ball this way. It was really built around this test expectation. And that test was the June 2021 LSAT. That test really guided a lot of the crystal ball that we just did before the April and June tests. What test did they use here for the domestic people? They used June 2021. So it's exactly as we expected. And obviously, not only is that a source of like great relief and kind of pride for us, but it means that the suggestions that we gave to people could not have been more tailored, suited to exactly the content that they saw. We'll get into the content here in just a second, obviously. But in terms of what we expected versus what happened, it was a 100% match.
Which is nice. And when we go into the mini ball on the 9th of May, we'll post that up and then show what appeared on the test and then eliminate it from the list, add in new predictive information, which is we'll keep it as current as possible for those June test takers. And we could have done this with the February LSAT because we'd seen something similar in the January, but there wasn't enough time. There was only a month between those two tests. Here with 2 months, this is why we're like, let's do this mini ball. Notice, John, that I will relentlessly use that phrase until it is adopted. allows us to update it, take that April out. So if you're taking June, now you know this is my test. And again, we may miss the topics when it comes up in June. As I've said before, this is a golden age of us being able to do this. It won't change anything about what they still test. We're still accurate with that. But let's get into the way things started out, especially on Friday morning, because it was good news pretty early on for us. We'll start off with the logic game section.
Sure.
That was coming from this June 21 test. And this was 23 questions. And the first section, we know this is real, starts off, it's got, I think, 6 songs going over 4 days. Then you've got study groups, and the groups, kind of like putting variables into those groups. The groups are geology, history, and industry, which I've always been like, that's a strange one. And then you've got a tough game about truck loading bays on the northwest and the south, probably the hardest overall game in the section. And then you end with volunteers on zoning and voting committees. So that was the same test that was used in June of 2021. Obviously, we're able to look at the content of what we had here with, linearity, grouping, some of the 6 into 4 stuff. And that's how we kind of designed some portions, not the entire problem set, but some portions of our problem set to mirror this so that students who did the recommended problem sets would feel as comfortable as possible. But if you had that section of logic games, it was in fact real. And the nice thing about logic games on this test was we didn't see any experimental logic games being administered. So for almost everybody, they knew that was the real thing. What was the other section of logic games? This section was also 23 questions. I saw this a little more on Saturday than on Friday. It started off with a really simple kind of linear game that was 6 into 6. So forgettable for most people that they often were like, oh yeah, I forgot I had that game. Moved into a game about 8 reporters covering 4 candidates. Then there were volunteers kind of working, fixing on park trails. Interesting game. And then the last, a game that I think was probably the hardest, almost had pattern elements to it. 4 people in 3 different meeting rooms at 3 different times, 1, 2, and 3 p.m. Not an easy game. And I think overall, the first section, probably easier, relatively speaking, as compared to the second section, which had some challenge within it. So those were your 2 logic games sections that, as far as we're aware, everybody saw. If you didn't see that, let us know. You were probably in a smaller test group. Maybe you'd seen some of these questions before if you'd taken the LSAT at a prior date. But that was the majority of people having those 2 sections. Again, the first of those 2, probably more middle of the road. The second of those 2, probably on the harder side comparatively. And we'll come back to the scale matrix in a little bit. But I think for most people, logic games isn't the question that they have. The question they have is either going to be RC or LR, where we saw experimentals. So let's move to RC, John.
Yeah. You want me to handle some of this?
I'm totally open.
You do it then.
I wasn't that open, man. You're supposed to say, no, I'll do it. All right. So let's start off with the 2 real sections that we saw, and then we'll close out with the 2 experimentals. And maybe you've got some, overall questions that you have. Let's start with the test that we felt like was the most likely one to occur, which is June 2021. That section opens up with a passage about Vera Brittain becoming a pacifist after World War I, moves into a passage about Canadian Inuits forming their own government territory. Maybe that's the Nunavut one, perhaps, I'm thinking.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, then there's a third one about enrichment courts and 2 types of equipoise, judges adding rules and so forth. And then it ends with a passage I think you're hot to read at some point, which is keystone predators and biodiversity. That's the comparative passage. It's a passage we've talked about on prior podcasts, simply because this section has been used before. So if you had that section, that was real. That would have been your scored RC. I know for some people that's very good news. And I'll say that is because it seemed like on this set of real versus experimental, the experimentals were probably the harder sections overall.
Yeah, I got that impression too. Note in those topics that Dave just mentioned, if you were part of that crystal ball cohort, you would have heard me say, go learn about Vera Brittain, or at least familiarize yourself. Do you know what a keystone predator is? No? You should probably know what that is going into this test. And there it was. Now, of course, that doesn't make up the totality of all the passages that were tested or topics that came up, but that kind of familiarity can be a real difference maker when you sit down and take this test. We gave it to them.
Let's expand on that for just a second. Let's say Vera Brittain is somebody that you're not familiar with, and you're like, well, maybe I go read about it. You go read about it. To me, that's education. I'm not going to say, oh, that was a waste of time. Then you get to the LSAT. If you see Vera Brittain on your test, as some people did, it's a rush. You're like, I already have some knowledge about this. Now, what was I looking for Vera Brittain? No, but if it came up, I was okay. Let's flip that around and say you didn't see Vera Brittain. There's no harm done. It doesn't change anything. You still do the passage exactly the way you would. As I've said, it's like 1 in 100 million that anybody can predict anything on this test in terms of topic. And so it doesn't have any negative effect. It's not a distraction. It's just something I think learning is good. This is the kind of stuff we know they're testing. You should be aware of it. Some people are really into copyright law and they know a lot about it. They have an advantage of copyright passages because they have context. That's what we're looking at with this. So in this particular instance, I had several people after the test, they're like, it's what you predicted.
Yep.
I felt so much better about it. And, that's an advantage they got. The people who didn't get this section and got something different, they didn't get that advantage. This is just the way that it works out when you have different tests happening for different people. Let's move to this next real passage section. And this was a new section that we haven't seen before historically that they put together. It started off with Jane Goodall's primate research. And of course, she's very famous for working with gorillas and monkeys and so forth. I mean, monkeys more so. Then it went to a lineup of criminal suspects. Are they doing it everyone all at once or one at a time? These types of things. Then you have a comparative passage about the social perception of artists and talking about literary biographies of writers and musicians such as Dickens and Strauss and so forth. And then last, you have linguists who are using outdated theories and how worldview is shaped by culture and not language. So I think this is probably, relatively speaking, slightly harder than the Vera Brittain Keystone Predator section, but probably not among the hardest of all reading comprehension passages. But if you had this Goodall criminal lineup, that was a real section for you. That would be scored. So that means that the other two sections we're going to talk about were both experimental sections. And I'm going to talk about one that we saw a lot paired with Vera Brittain and Keystone Predators. And this was not the easiest section. Neither of these were the easiest. This one was choosing menu options from a larger set versus a limited set, choice being an advantage or not. Then brain cells being grown in petri dishes in labs, the ethics around that. Aztec societies, modern judicial systems, and how their court system actually worked. And then a passage about romanicist language and throwing in some ideas of enlightenment and so forth. If you had that as one of your two RC sections, that was experimental. The other experimental section was one that started off with the idea of transformative anger, dealing with some of the writings of Seneca, Audre Lorde, and so forth. A passage about geomythology, which sounds really, really interesting. Beowulf and giant king's bones that were probably really from a mammoth or a whale. And then the old Roman politicians and poets, Cicero and Catullus, poem 49 and Caesar. And then the last passage in there about state laws, coercion, people's obligation to follow, control over services, and whether that's good or bad, and that's a comparative passage. This second set, also experimental. So geomythology and the poems and the old Roman kind of stuff, that was usually paired with the Jane Goodall and criminal lineup section. I'm not saying it was always, but it was very often in our experience paired with those two. And so too real, too experimental, kind of floating around out there.
And most people over the course of the weekend domestically seem to have that particular construction with double RC. So I think there was probably a lot of anxiety, or at least uncertainty, over what was real and experimental. I'm happy that we were able to know for sure and now reveal it. Hopefully that's good news. I think for most people it's going to be. As you said, the experimentals, unusually, seem to be harder for most people than the real passages did. I'd also say that this is probably, and this might be a bit of a stretch or go out on a limb here, but I'll do it. This might be the easiest set overall of real reading comp that we've seen in quite a while. Notice I said easiest.
Of real.
Right,
Yeah, you
of
didn't say it
real.
was easy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So in terms of the real passages here, I didn't see any killers.
I think the density that occurred more on the experimental side.
Uh-huh.
You had a lot of people coming out saying, one of my RC was easier than the other. And again, they weren't saying it was easy. They're all hard. But I felt like the density that we were seeing in the other sections outweighed what we saw in the real sections.
That's a good way to put it.
And that was one of the challenges of RC people coming out being like, well, I hope one of those is experimental and I hope it's this specific one. And obviously, hopefully this is good news for a lot of people at this particular point. So let's move on from that. We'll come back to it when we run through the matrix here. Jon, I'll just continue on if you don't mind and just do the LR.
I am not going to stop your stride, buddy. Keep going.
What? Nobody's breaking my stride. It's an old 80s song. So let's get into LR. And as we always do with LR these days, in order to avoid confusion, we're just going to talk about the real sections. We're going to avoid what we know to be experimental. We can identify 3 separate sections on this test that we feel very comfortable with as being scored sections. So you should hear your section within this set of 3 unless you had a real outlier. And the nice thing about the LR was by and large pretty reasonable stuff. As it came down. So let's talk about the first one, which had previously been used on that June 2021 LSAT, and various questions that appeared in that section. The topics, you had one about milk being bad for humans, protective bats, buildings and their ages in a certain neighborhood of a city, which is kind of like a central part of the city, but this was a question about 1800s houses. This is not the central business district question, which actually comes up in a later section. Again, that's that common topic thing that they do that can be really confusing. When I was, working this out, I was like, wait, this one has 1800s, this one doesn't. This one was about the ages of the buildings and them being from like the 1800s, I think maybe Victorian era kind of stuff. Then there was a question about fossilized Chinese dinosaur bones and being able to glide due to the formation of that forearm bone. Another great question about art forgeries and fakes. Are imitations still real art? A great question about crazed glass and fire and arson. And crazed glass, most people are like, is it glazed? No, it's crazed. It's like the series of cracking that occurs in the glass. Then there's the guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar, something I'm sure I'd be terrible at it. And then finally, smokers who are eating fruits and vegetables and the chances of getting cancer and, offsetting factors and so forth. Those were all real questions. They all appeared on that original June 21 test that we thought was most likely to appear. This section is pretty reasonable overall. Let's go to another real section that we know about. I think this section has some really interesting topics in my opinion. So if you had this as one of your 2 sections, this was also going to be scored. Question about coffee houses and microbreweries. I'm all about reading that question when they finally release it. Question about Napoleon dying from a poison, specifically arsenic, while imprisoned. Blue porcelain teapot. I love that. Talking about trading in the United Kingdom in the 7th and 8th centuries. Question about board games and social interactions. There's a question about candidate beating another candidate in a campaign, but that comes up so often, I think it makes it hard to determine what that is. Rooms of a haunted house. Sounds like a pretty good topic to write about.
Yeah, I'd like that one too.
Consultants accessing medical records without permission. Don't do that. Pollinating low bush blackberries that have been affected by black flies. And then another topic in there was the genes for the lack of pigmentation in hair, which is actually passed on or heritable only from the fathers. Another reasonable section, although let's be honest, some of the questions in here are difficult. So just something to be aware of. And let's go to our last real LR section that we know is floating around. Some of the topics on this are there's not enough dentists in a region, so they allow therapists to perform basic procedures, which is good for the kids, but not really helpful to the adults. Another question about lightning on Venus and space probes and what they can actually see. Question near the end of this section about capitalism sustaining technological innovation and long-term growth. I think that might have actually been the last question in this 25-question section. Question about users complaining about a redesign of a website with features they requested, and then they changed it to take those out, and then the users complained again. It's like you can never make them happy. Question about working out within 3 hours of bedtime and how the quality of your sleep is affected. Question about paying for blood donations and whether that's good or bad. And then another question about snakes lacking expression or vocalization. So it's hard to figure out, their moods, their actions, and so forth. And then there was a question in here about a central business district, which I think was more about taxation than about the age of the houses and so forth. But that was a real section as well. If you can figure out which of those sections that you had, if you had 2 LR, then you'll know the real one. You'll automatically know the experimental. And I'll be honest, John, one of the reasons you and I were talking about the LSAT all the way until really 11 o'clock on Saturday was trying to work out LR and piece it together. It was probably the biggest challenge I think we've had in maybe the last 6 to 9 months of doing this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this was easily the hardest to try to piece together, the thorniest. Let me make a comment here about the matching of this stuff. The key isn't that you recognize every single question, topic that Dave just read. It's that if a couple of those match one of your sections, that's enough. So, for instance, if you remember Napoleon dying from arsenic, but you can't remember a question about a blue porcelain teapot, that's okay. That Napoleon dying is literally enough to know that that section is real. If you're like, yeah, I remember board games, but a haunted house, that's okay. That's enough. That section counted. So don't try to match every one of these with 100% because memories aren't that good, frankly. We give this many questions to have this many targets, basically, not to try to get some sort of 100% coverage or match. I think a lot of people get flustered or flummoxed a bit by this because they're like, I don't remember a question about snakes. That's all right. Do you remember any of the other ones? Lightning on Venus, working out within 3 hours of bedtime. That's the key.
And then take that information, and if you're like, all right, I had LR second and third, and I know that snake question was third. Well, now you should have a recollection of I struggled with section 2, but I felt a lot better about section 3 LR. And now you know that 3 was real. You're like, okay, so the section I struggled in, regardless of whether you remember anything about it, now you know that's experimental.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and I'll add the following thing. Sometimes it frustrates people to not be able to remember certain questions, and they're like, there's something wrong with me. No, this happens to everybody. This is a pressurized experience, and during that, things that you normally, in the course of your daily life, would have no problem with, they completely change. You act in different ways. It reminds me of the old Nick Saban thing that he tells the Alabama football team. He's like, we can all walk across this 2x4 right here.
Oh, right.
Set it up 1 foot off the ground. We'll all walk about. We won't even think about it. Every one of us will do it. Now, let's put that between 2 buildings, 1,000 feet in the air, and watch how much harder it is. Pressure. It changes your perceptions. It changes your actions. I have literally had conversations with people, in years past, where I'm like, yeah, these were the games on this test back when there was only 1 scored game section. And they just said flatly to me, no, that's not what I had. I don't remember any of those games. I don't remember any of those passages. That's not my test. I had a different test. And of course, you'd stop and be like, wait, is that really the case? And then they get their test released back when they released tests. And it would be like, no, they had the exact same test we were talking about. But the pressure had just erased all their recollection. That is something that we know happens. It's why we talk about the pressurized nature of this. So if you can tag 1 question in here or 2 questions and connect it and be like, I did have that one about paying for blood donations, then you know it's real. And then that helps you assess how you might have actually done on this.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So let's then put the final coup de grace piece on this with the scoring matrix. And John, I'll just continue.
You're on such a roll, man. It would be almost a shame to stop you.
So again, the matrix, just like I briefly mentioned for internationals, if you skipped over that section, we always look at this as number of questions missed. How many questions could you miss to get a 170 is our baseline for difficulty? We start at you could miss 7 questions. When we make these estimations of how the sections affect that, we will always be conservative. And the way we'll go through this is we'll either say to you that the section has no impact, you stay at -7, or maybe it'll loosen it. On rare occasions, it might tighten it. So as you follow this, start at -7 in your mind and then just listen for each one of your games, comp, and logical reasoning sections, and then adjust that. And that'll give you the general idea for how many questions you could miss to get a 170 and so forth. So let's start off at -7 and take a look at logic games. This first section we'll talk about is the truck loading bays and the zoning voting committees. We've talked about this before, and I don't think this is an easy section, but I also don't think that it's moving the scale, which I think irritates some people.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. The most I could probably be able to give it is like 0.5, meaning it's not going to move the scale at 170, but it would move it down scale. The other logic game section on here was reporters covering candidates, volunteers and park trails, meeting rooms. This was, in our estimation, the harder of the two sections. We're going to say that this moves the scale by 1. So if you had this, it moves it from 7 to 8. So either 0 at the top, but getting kind of a bonus downscale, or moving it by 1 at 170 all the way down from there is where we're at. So everybody at this point is either still at 7 or at 8. And interestingly enough, it's going to stay that way. Reading comprehension. The first passage was the Inuits, the Keystone Predators, and so forth.
Vera Brittain.
Vera Brittain. That is the one that we have done before. And when we talked about this, we left it as having no impact, as 0. So if you were at 7, you're still at 7. If you're at 8 that you could miss, you're still at 8. When we go to the Jane Goodall passage set and the criminal lineup and the biographies and the linguists, same exact result. This is why Jon said before that probably, the easiest pairing of real sections in a while. Again, easiest being relative. This will not move the scale either. So if you're at 7, you stay at 7. If you're at 8, you stay at 8, no matter what reading comp you had. And that's actually going to be the case for LR as well. Had a lot of reports about, hey, this was a reasonable LR section. There's always tough questions, but it was still relatively reasonable. So if you had the milk's bad for humans, protecting bats, the crazed glass, the fossilized Chinese dinosaur bones, art forgeries, and so forth, no change to your scaling. So if you're at 7, you stay. If you're at 8, you stay. The coffee houses and breweries section with Napoleon, dying of arsenic, blue porcelain teapot, board games, and so forth, also no impact. And then the last section that we talked about, the dentists, affecting children, positively, but not the adults, the Venus and the lightning, the capitalism growth, the blood donations, the snake expressions, also no impact. So everybody comes out of this with our prediction either being you could miss 7 and get a 170, or you could miss 8 and get a 170. And that is the entire matrix right there.
Yep. And that -8 group, who maybe feels a little bit lucky, only consists of people who got those games about the reporters covering candidates, the volunteers, and the park trails and the meeting rooms. If you didn't have those games, you're a -7, in our opinion.
Yeah. And this isn't to say this test wasn't hard. The thing about the way scaling works like this is it always feels difficult. And so when we say 7, it's not like that's an easy test. There are tests out there with 7 that you can miss. It's a normal test. This is not an unexpected outcome. I don't want anyone to think, I got an easy test and screwed it up. No. And there'll be questions in all of these that you're going to struggle on. That is what the LSAT is. It is a struggle. Even when you're really good at it, there are things you run across, you're like, man, that made me think for a while. The point, though, is that to get a 170 is hard.
Yeah.
7 questions out of, say, 75 or 76 questions overall, they're giving you 10% of the questions, slightly less than that you can miss to still get a score that is in the very top percentiles. So think about what the task is. If you felt that it was hard, that's how they want you to feel. That's how people have been feeling about this test for decades. So hopefully this gives some guidance on it. Obviously, we'll find out how people did on Wednesday, May 3rd at 9 a.m. when they release the scores. But for now, Jon, this was a long week for us. I know Friday and Saturday, you and I both collectively put in like over 30 hours individually. It was a lot.
Yeah, I don't know if people can hear it in the tone of my voice, but I, for one, am wiped. And part of me is actually kind of glad that I'm not going to be there for the festivities tonight. I don't know that I would be my full 100% party animal self.
Well, it's because it didn't slow down on Sunday. I put in another like 12 hours trying to figure it all out. And yesterday was the same kind of thing, or Monday and a good portion of Tuesday. I feel like I've spent 3 work weeks just in the past 5 days. So not loving that. I feel your fatigue. If you are in the Napa Valley area or the general Bay Area and you feel like driving up to Napa, we have posted that we'll be in Napa at 6 p.m. tonight. And there is an open bar for LSAT students, not for non-LSAT students. They get no drinks until we run out of the cash that PowerScore has provided. So if so, come join me. Mike Spiva will be there. A bunch of his consultants, they're in town for a big conference that they're having. We'd love to see him.
All right. I got nothing to add.
All right. On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, and we hope you have, please leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions about this episode or general LSAT or admissions questions, you can send those to us at lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, we hope this was helpful. We hope you did great on this particular test. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.